Imagine a spring afternoon in Oklahoma, where the air suddenly refuses to move. A silence so heavy, it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. In the small town of Spiro, the year was 1976, and the date was March 26th. For one woman, it began as a day of laundry and routine, a mundane stretch of hours in a life built on the steady, predictable rhythms of the American heartland. But within 3 minutes, her world would be dismantled by a force so immense it defies the standard vocabulary of disaster. This is the story of how a human body survives the interior of an F5 vortex, a kinetic monster with winds exceeding 260 miles per hour, and the 50-year psychological tax of that endurance. How do you rebuild a life when the very ground beneath you was once pulled into the sky? What remains of a person after the atmosphere tries to erase them? Spiro, Oklahoma, sits in a geographic cradle where the cold, dry air from the Rockies frequently entangles with the warm, moist breath of the Gulf. In 1976, it was a community defined by its proximity to the earth. Farming, faith, and a stoic acceptance of the risks inherent to Tornado Alley. To live here was to understand the sky as a neighbor that could, at any moment, turn violent deficiency of a local. She knew the smell of ozone that precedes a storm, that sharp, metallic tang that rises from the dirt when the barometric pressure begins to shift. The afternoon was deceptively golden. In Oklahoma, you don't fear the wind you can see. You fear the moment the wind stops talking. By 3:30 p.m., the birds had ceased their chatter. The cattle in the nearby fields had already turned their backs to the southwest, huddled in a collective, instinctive dread. At this moment, the storm was still a theoretical threat, a blip on a distant radar. But the science of an F5 is a study in absolute physics. We are talking about a pressure deficit so extreme it can cause structures to literally explode outward. We are talking about wind speeds that can strip the asphalt from a road as easily as a child peels a sticker from a page. As 3:45 p.m. approached, the sky didn't just turn gray. It turned a bruised, sickly shade of violet. The routine of the day, the folding of clothes, the steeping of tea, was suddenly interrupted by a low-frequency vibration that felt less like a sound and more like a seizure in the earth itself. The woman stood on her porch, looking toward the horizon, and saw the dead man walking. This is a phenomenon where a multi-vortex tornado appears to have legs as smaller sub-vortices rotate around the central core. It is the visual signature of a killer. The atmospheric shift was instantaneous. The barometric pressure dropped so sharply it caused a piercing inner ear pain, a sensation often described by survivors as cosmic vertigo. It is the feeling of the world losing its grip on you. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision. In the geography of survival, those 30 seconds are a lifetime. She realized her hallway, the place she had been told was safe, was no longer a haven. The house was screaming, not the wind, but the timber and the nails. Groaning under a load they were never engineered to carry. It didn't sound like a wind. It sounded like the earth itself was being fed into a massive industrial grinder. The radio in the kitchen cut out mid-sentence, leaving her in total auditory isolation. The silence of the radio was replaced by the roar of 1,000 freight trains. A sound so loud, it becomes a physical presence in the room. As the first window shattered, sending shards of glass into the drywall like shrapnel, she realized that the walls were no longer keeping the storm out. They were becoming part of it. She threw herself toward the floor, reaching for the only thing that felt solid, the heavy cast-iron plumbing beneath the floorboards. For 3 minutes, she didn't live in Oklahoma. She lived in a dimension made of splintered wood and red clay. Homes is suspended in mid-air by the sheer upward velocity of the inflow. She felt her body being lifted, her fingers cramping as she clung to the foundation. This is the stubborn grasp of physics. She felt the impact of flying debris. A piece of 2x4 lumber, a brick, a handful of gravel turned into a shotgun blast. Her skin was being sandblasted by pulverized insulation and grit. Amidst the chaos, her hand brushed against a small wooden jewelry box, a family heirloom. She clutched it to her chest with a ferocity that bypassed logic. It was a micro-commitment to the world that was currently being erased. When the roar finally faded, it was replaced by a sound far more terrifying. Absolute ringing silence, leaving behind a vacuum of sound and life. She opened her eyes to find the sky above her. There was no roof. There were no walls. She was lying in a bed of red mud and shattered porcelain. The landscape was unrecognizable. The landmarks that had guided her through town for years, the massive oaks, the church spire, the neighbor's barn, had been erased from the earth. Emerging from the wreckage is a slow, hallucinatory process. The extraction of oneself from the ruins of a life is a sensory overload. She tasted grit and sulfur. Her skin was coated in a fine layer of gray dust, a mixture of her home's insulation and the pulverized remains of the town. She looked for her front door and realized she was standing on the spot where her bedroom used to be, 50 feet from the foundation. The tornado hadn't just blown her house down, it had rearranged the geography of her existence. She saw a neighbor wandering through a field, his clothes torn, his face a mask of red mud. In the wake of a black swan event like an F5, social roles collapse. There is no status, no wealth, only the immediate hierarchy of the injured and the able. They looked at each other with a 1,000-yard stare, a look of trauma recognition that needs no translation. The physical storm had passed, but the psychological one was just beginning to gather strength. In the hours following the impact, survival becomes a series of small, stubborn choices made in the mud. There was no power, no phone lines, and the roads were blocked by a chaotic weave of downed power lines and uprooted trees. The survivors of Spiro began to organize without a central authority. This is the community engine, the inherent logic of ingenuity that emerges when everything is lost. She used a torn curtain as a bandage for the deep laceration on her leg. She found a broken chair and used a piece of its leg as a makeshift splint for a neighbor's arm. Resource scarcity became the primary antagonist. The water pipes had been ripped from the ground, contaminating the local supply. They had to scavenge for sealed containers, for anything that hadn't been touched by the storm's breath. Amidst the ruins, she found her jewelry box again. It was caked in mud, the wood splintered, but it was intact. It was a symbol of her internal resilience, a piece of the before that had survived the after. But as the sun set on the ruins of Spiro, a new kind of darkness began to settle over the survivors. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of what had occurred. To survive an F5 is a miracle. but it is a miracle that comes with a heavy price. This is the survival tax. In 1976, the term PTSD was not yet part of the common vernacular. But the symptoms were present in every shaking hand and every hollowed-out gaze in Spiro. For the next 50 years, the wind never truly stopped blowing in her mind. Every subsequent thunderstorm became a fever dream. The sound of a passing train or the sudden darkening of the sky would trigger a physiological response. Peripheral vasoconstriction, an electrolyte imbalance of fear, the primitive brain taking over. She watched as the town rebuilt, as the scars on the topography were covered by new grass and fresh asphalt. But the scars on the people remained. Returning to Spiro today, 5 decades later, the protagonist speaks with a voice that is calm and authoritative, yet weary. She has lived a full life in the shadow of those 3 minutes. She calls it second-hand endurance. It is the process of living with a memory that refuses to dim. The wind eventually stopped blowing that day in 1976. But in her mind, it's been howling for 50 years. To live with the memory of an F5 is a choice made every single morning. It is the choice to remain standing when the world has already proven it can move you. Complacency kills, they say. But for the survivors of Spiro, complacency was never an option again. They learned the hard way that nature doesn't care about your plans or your history. The environment always wins in a direct confrontation of force. So the human spirit must win through the stubbornness of its persistence. Survival isn't 90% mental. It is 100% the refusal to be unmade. Looking out over the fields of Spiro now, the land is green and quiet. It is deceptively peaceful. But if you look closely at the older trees, you can still see the twists in their trunks, the permanent deformities caused by the wind half a century ago. The people are the same. They carry the survival tax in the way they watch the horizon, in the way they built their new homes with reinforced cellars and thick concrete. The final message she offers to the next generation is one of awe and peace. The sky can take your home, your town, and your peace. But it cannot take the fact that you stood your ground when the world tried to move you. In the end, calories are currency and gear is just a security blanket. But the human spirit is an immovable object. She stands in an open field, looking at the clouds, no longer afraid of the dark violet hues. She has paid her tax. She has survived the abyss. She has proven that while the wind can strip the asphalt from the road, it cannot strip the dignity from a soul that refuses to break. The story of Spiro is not a story of a tornado. It is a story of the 50 years that followed. It is a clinical study in what remains of a human being when the world forgets they exist. And then they remind the world by simply continuing to be. One foot in front of the other, through the mud and the years, until the silence is no longer deafening, but a sanctuary. We often talk about the thin line between life and death. But for those who have stood in the eye of an F5, that line isn't thin. It's a wide, chaotic territory they must navigate for the rest of their lives. They are the cartographers of a blank space on the map of human experience. As we look at the quiet streets of Spiro today, we must respect the mountain of memory these survivors climb every day. Hindsight is 20/20, but foresight is a gift born of trauma. As she closes her jewelry box one last time during the interview, the click of the latch is a definitive sound. It is a small sound, but in the context of an F5, it is a triumph. It is the sound of a life contained, protected, and cherished. The world may be indifferent, and nature may be brutal, but the story of the Spiro woman is a testament to the fact that, even in the face of an atmospheric monster, the human heart maintains its rhythm. It is a rhythm that outlasts the storm, outlasts the ruins, and eventually outlasts the fear itself. The legacy of 1976 is not found in the casualty counts or the damage estimates. It is found in the steady gaze of a woman who looked into the blackest sky Oklahoma ever produced and decided she wasn't going anywhere. That is the ultimate survival logic. That is the testament of the spirit. And as the sun sets on Spiro today, the horizon remains clear. A silent promise kept for 50 years. The wind may blow again, but she, and the town she helped rebuild, will be ready. Because they know that while the environment always wins the battle of force, the human heart wins the war of time. The latch didn't just click, it bit into the strike plate with a metallic finality that echoed against the concrete floor. Outside, the atmosphere still churned with that bruised purplish light. But inside the shelter, the air turned thick and humid, smelling of damp limestone and old pennies. She slumped against the cool wall, her fingers still vibrating from the frantic scramble. The silence down there wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, pressurized void that made her ears pop painfully. "Everyone breathe," she whispered, though the words felt like dry husks in her throat. "Just breathe." Her grandson huddled in the corner, his small knuckles white as he gripped a battery-powered lantern. The light flickered, casting jittery, elongated shadows that danced across the low ceiling. He didn't cry. The terror was too vast for tears, a primal paralysis that had seized his tiny limbs. Above them, the first stones began to rattle. It started as a rhythmic drumming, like 1,000 fingers tapping on the steel door, escalating into a frantic, jagged staccato. Then came the vibration. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a frequency that vibrated your bone marrow. The concrete beneath her palms began to shudder, a rhythmic convulsing that signaled the arrival of the core. "It sounds like a freight train," the neighbors always said. They were wrong. It sounded like the earth itself was being fed into a wood chipper. It was a grinding, screeching, mechanical howl. The scream of nails being wrenched from floorboards and the wet thud of ancient oaks being snapped like brittle toothpicks. "It's taking the porch," she thought, her eyes tracking the ceiling as if she could see through the layers of dirt and reinforcement. There goes the swing. There goes the wicker chair where I watched the swallows yesterday. Each splintering crack felt like a physical blow to her chest. This wasn't just a weather event, it was an erasure. The house, the physical manifestation of 30 years of sweat, mortgage payments, and birthday parties, was being peeled away layer by layer. She closed her eyes and saw the kitchen table, the one with the deep scratch from a dropped cast-iron skillet, spinning into the black maw of the vortex. She saw the photograph of her mother, the glass shattering, the paper pulped into gray slush by the rain. The pressure shifted. Her chest felt hollowed out, as if a giant vacuum were attempting to pull the very air from her lungs. This was the moment of peak intensity, the near miss that defines a life. "Don't look up, Danny," she commanded, her voice rasping. She threw her body over the boy, creating a human canopy. She smelled the dust-clogged scent of his hair, lavender shampoo, and sweat, and anchored herself to that one sensory truth. The door groaned. The steel began to bow inward, just a fraction of an inch, as the suction clawed at the entrance. She jammed her boot against the frame, a futile, stubborn gesture of defiance. "You can't have him," she snarled internally. "You can take the shingles. You can take the rafters. You can scatter the cedar chest across 3 counties, but you don't get the boy." The screeching reached a crescendo that transcended noise and became pure, unadulterated heat. And then, as quickly as the carnage had erupted, the pressure snapped back. The grinding ceased, replaced by a wet, heavy dripping. She didn't move for 10 minutes. She waited for the tail of the storm, the deceptive secondary winds that often catch the unwary. When she finally unbolted a door, the resistance was immense. She had to put her shoulder into it, heaving against a mountain of debris that had been piled against their sanctuary. The world she emerged into was unrecognizable. The sky had transitioned to a sickening, bruised ochre. The horizon was jagged. Where the tree line used to be, there were only splintered masts, stripped of bark and leaves, standing like toothpicks in a graveyard. The air tasted of pulverized insulation and raw earth. "Stay behind me," she cautioned, stepping over a twisted hunk of aluminum siding that had wrapped itself around a fence post like a silver ribbon. Her house was gone. Not collapsed. Gone. The foundation was swept clean, leaving only the linoleum floor of the bathroom and a single, solitary toilet standing amidst the ruins. It looked absurd. A porcelain monument to the mundane in the center of a catastrophe. She spotted a flash of red in the mud. Reaching down, she pulled out a tattered fragment of her favorite quilt. It was heavy with silt, the intricate stitching undone by the sheer velocity of the wind. She squeezed it, the cold, muddy water trailing down her arm. "Grandma?" Danny's voice was small, trembling. He was looking at the space where the living room used to be. "Where's the TV? Where's the couch?" She looked at the empty slab. She looked at the twisted remains of her life scattered across the Oklahoma prairie. Then she looked at his hands. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a heart still thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Those were just things, Danny," she said, her voice regaining its iron core. "We're the house now. As long as we're standing, the house isn't gone." The weeks that followed weren't defined by grand philosophical breakthroughs, but by the grueling, bone-deep ache of recovery. It was the sound of chainsaws screaming at dawn and the smell of burning debris piles that choked the evening air. She lived in a FEMA trailer that rattled whenever a heavy truck passed, a cruel reminder of the vibrations that had nearly claimed them. Every time a dark cloud gathered on the horizon, her heart would gallop, a Pavlovian response to the trauma carved into her nervous system. But she didn't leave. She spent her afternoons picking through the mud, salvaging what the vortex had deemed unworthy of consumption. A silver spoon, a mud-caked encyclopedia, a single earring. Each item was a victory. A small piece of the past reclaimed from the belly of the beast. Neighbors who had been strangers 6 months prior now shared jugs of water and boxes of nails. There was a new dialect in Spiro, a language of lumber dimensions, insurance adjusters, and roof pitches. They didn't talk about spirit. They talked about 2x4s and hurricane clips. They talked about the dead zone where the siren hadn't reached. She watched as the first new rafters were hoisted toward the sky. The wood was raw and blonde, smelling of pine and promise. Each hammer strike was a heartbeat. Each nail driven home was a middle finger to the clouds. "We aren't just rebuilding a town," she remarked to a volunteer as they cleared a clogged drainage ditch. "We're stitching the earth back together." Decades later, the scars on the land have scabbed over with thick Bermuda grass and new-growth oak. If you drive through Spiro today, you might miss the signs of the 1976 scar tissue unless you know where to look. You have to see the way certain trees lean, or notice the houses that don't quite match the vintage of the rest of the block. But the scars on the people remain visible in the way they watch the sky. There is a specific tilt of the head, a narrowing of the eyes when the wind shifts to the southwest and the humidity spikes. She still keeps a bag packed by the cellar door. It contains water, a radio, and a fresh change of clothes for Danny, who is now a man with children of his own. It's not an act of fear. It's an act of respect. She knows the power of the atmospheric engine, but she also knows the durability of her own resolve. The storm took her roof, her walls, and her memories, but it failed to take her footing. She remains a fixture of the landscape, as rooted as the limestone beneath her feet. The legacy of that day isn't the destruction. It's the stubborn, beautiful persistence of the survivors who chose to plant their seeds in the same soil that tried to swallow them whole. As the crickets begin their evening chorus and the first stars pierce the darkening blue, she sits on her new porch, built with better bolts and stronger wood, and listens to the wind. It's just a breeze tonight, a soft, cooling caress that carries the scent of rain and cut grass. She closes her eyes, feels the steady pulse in her wrist, and smiles. The war of time continues, and for one more night, she is winning.